So last week I was talking to you about the fact that I had been invited to have an honor of being and delivering the keynote address for for IUS, like their media program, their media day that they have, where they host a bunch of different area high schools, and there's several hundred high school students that are in attendance and all this stuff. They had invited me like a couple months ago, and I was like, yeah, all right, cool, great, we'll do it. And then like it creeps up, and it's literally the next day, and I'm like, I don't know what I'm going to talk about. You know,
haven't even started
to prepare. And so I started psyching myself out because, you know, I tell my wife, I'm like, listen, I need to have at least some moments to sit down and organize my thoughts. And she's like, yep, I get it. You know, we're going to go off. We're going to leave the house. And so the house will be empty for you to just kind of do, right?
No distractions. Did they take all the animals? Because you do have many of those.
No, they were still there, but not a distraction. So
okay.
I decided to go with what you said and just kind of write it out, right? And just
and
completely
it etches it on your brain.
Right. I just wrote it out word for word. Whereas before I'm like, I'm just going to do just a couple bullet points because like my mom's like, oh, you know what you're talking about. You could just wing it. And
yes,
so that
everybody thinks you can just wing it in any situation because you're on the radio.
Right. Exactly. And then of course I'm sitting there going, okay, well, you know, it's kind of an important speech. It's kicking off this day. I'm supposed to inspire them and get them excited about, media and journalism and all that sort of stuff.
Sort of like a generalized point, like a purpose to the entire speech.
Yes,
right?
yes, exactly.
A takeaway.
And it's supposed to be like about 25 minutes and stuff like that. So, anyways, so I script it out, I write it out, and get there and deliver it. And it was funny because as I'm getting ready to get up, one of the professors are like, "Hey, so how did you get into radio?" And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and pause you there because I'm going to explain that whole thing, that whole story of how I even got into radio in my address. And she's like, oh, okay, great. This is wonderful. So
yeah, you got to include that. I mean, that is sharing your path. And
so,
that's what the kids need to hear.
Yeah. So, and I remember receiving, even afterwards, and some people commenting the fact that, it's those stories of, hey, we weren't always perfect growing up. We made mistakes. And that was part of like my theme was hey, you know what? If success leaves clues, failure is the blueprint to success, right? So it's like you got to mess up a few times, build that blueprint, write the blueprint, and everything like that. So,
or maybe you thought you were going down one path and you realized that's not necessarily my path, and
right.
I got to change gears.
Right.
And that's
so
okay.
I told the story about how I went to school for pre-med, right? My parents were both in academia and in medicine, so I thought that's what I'm going to do. I got to get a half a semester in, and I'm struggling doing my biology homework. I had the news on, and it was crazy because I actually saw an anchor on the news mess up. And they messed up. The other people at the desk had a brief laugh and they moved on, right? And I thought to myself, what am I doing here? I'm like failing at biology. They look like they're having fun. I could do that. I could mess up. And the next day I go to my advisor and I dropped every class I was taking. I started down in the new path of broadcast journalism. And so I took an internship at a radio station. I stayed on. Even after the internship was over, I wasn't getting paid. And then one night, it's a Friday night, I get a call about 10 o'clock from my boss, who, keep in mind, I'm still an unpaid internship. I had started the internship in March. This is October, right? And so he calls me about 10 o'clock on a Friday night and is like, hey, what are you doing? I'm like, what's going on?
What do you mean, boss?
Yeah, what are you doing? He's like, hey, someone called in sick. Do you want to go and be on the air at midnight?
And you got your moment. They had nobody else. This is your moment.
Right. And so I said, and this is after months of, me doing these like little radio shows in production studios and giving my boss my air checks and the little examples of what I would sound like on the air, because that's the catch-22 in this business is you're never going to get hired to be on the radio unless we understand what you're going to sound like on the radio. But how are you going to sound like what you sound like on the radio unless you have a job in radio, right?
You can't get a show unless you do a show.
Right. Exactly. exactly. So that was
Yeah.
my whole thing. So, it was all this, you're not ready. No, no, no. And then he calls and he's like, hey. And so I remember asking the students there as I'm giving my speech, I'm like, it's Friday night. I'm in college. What do you think I'm doing? And one student yells on the side, studying.
You're like,
I go,
no.
maybe I'm reading the room wrong. I probably should have been studying, but I was actually partying, right? So, I tell everyone at the party, I'm like, I'm going to be on the radio. They all cheer and whatever. And so I had a couple hours before I had to be there, so I sobered up. I cracked the mic professionally.
I sobered up before I went to do my first show.
I know! This is legit, right? So I in real time, I'm cracking the mic there in Columbus, Ohio, thousands and thousands of people hearing my own voice, processed, transmitted to all those, and I sucked. It was terrible. I was nervous. I was only newly sober. My adrenaline rush wore off after a couple hours.
Newly sober.
Right.
That should have made you more entertaining, to be real.
Well, I absolutely bombed, right? And so this was my opportunity. And was I the last person he called? Most definitely I was. Was it luck? No, it was not, and that was part of my point. It was like, I had built that, luck is what happens when preparation and opportunity meet. And so that's what kind of my whole focus was of that. And so, that's just a little anecdotal story that I told to the students there. And it was funny just hearing it back, afterwards. Some of the students are coming up and they're talking to me afterwards, and even some people were posting on social media, which is kind of cool. They're like, it's so like refreshing hearing how terrible you were. I'm like,
we all have to start somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, we all listen. We all can't come out of the womb sounding like Kelly and I, right?
Right, right.
Professional, clean, and well-adjusted individuals.
But your whole point of you just kind of have to be ready, though, when opportunity knocks, because it was the same thing for me. I was 19, got an internship. Within 1 week of my internship, they throw me in the studio to do some commercials because they didn't have any female voices. Within a month, I was doing an overnight shift. And then within the first year, I was doing their morning show because their girl left, got a big old job in Atlanta. And so they're like, all right, Kelly, we can't afford to pay anybody else. Will you do it? And I'm like, okay, because I was just getting part-time pay at the time because I was in college, didn't have to support myself, and they took advantage of that. But that's how I got my experience. And so I got literally thrown into the fire doing a morning show at 19 in college.
Again, Kelly's ascension to morning show and mine are completely different. Completely different, right?
It's a little quicker.
But anyways, thank you to the folks there at IUS for inviting me out. I thought it was great. And then one of the advisors that helped set it all up, she was actually a guest DJ on the show like years and years and years ago.
That full circle moment.
Yeah, a little full circle moment there. So that's pretty cool. So anyways, thank you guys.